Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the tragic story of Cicero, Jester, killer, and keeper of a god's corpse. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what games you want me to cover next. And subscribe if this helps you sleep. Before the bells. There is a version of Cicero that most players never really consider. Not the giggling madman in Motley, not the little jester with the twin blades and the unsettling laugh. There is an earlier Cicero, one who wore dark leather, moved silently through streets and shadows, and was regarded by his Brotherhood family as one of the most technically refined assassins in all of Cyrodiil. That version of the man existed before the journals began to crack at the edges, before the laugh became something involuntary and strange, before he started talking to a body in a barrel and hearing it talk back. Understanding who Cicero was before his unraveling is the only way to understand why his unraveling matters at all. It is easy to look at what he became and assume he was always that way. He was not. The Dark Brotherhood in its time operated across the breadth of Tamriel, with sanctuaries spread throughout the continent. The Cyrodiil chapter was never the most powerful, but it had a long and storied history. Cicero began in the Bruma Sanctuary, which was destroyed, and then moved to the Cheydinhal Sanctuary, the one that would become the center of his story, and the last Brotherhood stronghold he would call home before the long journey north. We do not know exactly when he joined. The journals he left behind, the ones you find in his quarters at the Falkreath Sanctuary, do not begin from the very beginning. They begin part-way through a life already committed to darkness, already shaped by years of training and service. But what they reveal, even in the silences between lines, is a man who was not simply born broken. He was made that way slowly, across years that took everything from him one piece at a time. What we know of Cicero's early Brotherhood life comes primarily from the tone and content of his journals, combined with the broader picture painted by those few members who survived the Brotherhood's collapse and made it to Skyrim. Nazir, the Red Guard who handles contracts in the Dark Brotherhood Sanctuary, is one of the few members who has any meaningful commentary on Cicero's history. What comes through in his dialogue is a wary respect, a sense that whatever Cicero was before, he was not always this. The journals themselves are what confirm this most clearly. The early volumes show someone who was not a lunatic, but someone exceptionally precise. The Brotherhood's craft demands a particular psychology, patience over fury, calculation over passion, the willingness to become invisible while watching someone's life before ending it. Cicero had that psychology in full measure, and for a long time, it was his defining characteristic. He was small even then. He was quick. He spoke in a way that was slightly heightened even before the madness fully arrived. There is something theatrical in all of his recorded dialogue and journal entries that suggests a man who always experienced himself as slightly apart from the world, watching it from just outside, narrating as he went. This is not madness. This is a particular kind of personality that is drawn to the Brotherhood's strange code, the tenets, the Black Sacrament, the rituals of the void. People who see the world as stage and themselves as performers within it often find that the Brotherhood's formalized structure provides something they cannot find elsewhere. A role with clear expectations, a costume with clear meaning, a family with clear rules. Cicero fit the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood fit Cicero, in the way that a blade fits a well-made scabbard. His skill was genuine. The journals make this clear not through boasting, because the later Cicero who writes most of them is too far gone for straightforward pride, but through the quiet confidence that occasionally surfaces when he describes past contracts, There is an offhand familiarity with technique, with planning, with the mechanics of moving unseen through populated spaces that reads as deeply earned. He had done this work for a long time before anything went wrong. He had been good at it. He had, in the way that members of the Brotherhood's old organization were trained to feel, taken something close to professional pride in it. When he describes a completed contract in the early journal entries, the details he chooses to include are telling. He notes the routes he used to enter a location. He notes the timing of a guard rotation, the height of a window, the specific angle from which a mark was most vulnerable at a particular hour. He does not record these things to impress an imagined reader. He records them because this is how he processes what he has done. Through the particulars of the craft, through the technical and spatial intelligence that made him effective. The early journals read, in these sections, almost like a craftsman's workbook, precise, efficient, proud, in the specific way that someone who is very good at something difficult and exacting is proud. Not loudly, just with a steadiness that requires no external confirmation. The tenets of the Dark Brotherhood, the code that governed the organization's behavior, were not simply rules to Cicero. They were theology. The Void, Sithis, the Night Mother herself as speaker between Sithis and the mortal world. These were not metaphors to him. They were the literal structure of his universe. This matters because it is this literalness of belief that becomes the mechanism of his eventual destruction. A person who treats religious practice as somewhat ceremonial can walk away from it when ceremony becomes impossible. A person for whom the ceremony is the substance of reality itself has nowhere to go when the ceremony falls apart. Cicero had nowhere to go. And so, when it fell apart, he went somewhere inside himself instead. For now, though, before the journals, before the contract, before the costume, he was simply a skilled and loyal assassin, working in the Brotherhood Cyrodiil chapter, taking his contracts, fulfilling his obligations, and believing completely that he was doing exactly what Sithis had placed him in the world to do. That version of Cicero, certain and capable, is the one we have to hold in mind as we follow the thread forward into what came next. The Brotherhood in decline, the Dark Brotherhood that Cicero served in Cyrodiil, was not the Brotherhood at its peak. By the time his story properly begins, the organization had already passed through its golden age and entered a long, slow deterioration, the kind that institutions suffer when belief hollows out faster than structure can compensate. The Brotherhood still had its sanctuaries, still had its tenets, still had its rituals and contracts, and the elaborate machinery of organized murder. What it was losing, year by year, was the thing that made all of that machinery feel like more than a business arrangement. Its connection to the Night Mother, and through her, to Sithis himself. This is worth understanding in some detail, because the institutional decline of the Brotherhood is not merely background noise to Cicero's story. It is his story in the deepest sense. Everything that happens to him is downstream of the Brotherhood's collapse. He did not go mad in isolation. He went mad watching his entire world disassemble itself around him while he stood in the middle of it, holding the one piece that he believed could anchor everything back together, screaming for people to pay attention to what he was holding. The Brotherhood of Cicero's era had already lost its listener, the one member designated to hear the Night Mother's whispers, to receive contracts directly from the divine source, and to transmit them to the rest of the organization. Volume 1 of Cicero's journals mentions Alysane Dupré by name. She was a female Breton, the last known listener of the Brotherhood, and her death left the position vacant. After her, silence. The journals suggest that silence had lasted long enough that most of the Brotherhood had begun to accommodate it as a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. Contracts still came through conventional channels. Business continued. But the spiritual core of the operation, the belief that Sithis moved through the Night Mother and the Night Mother moved through the listener and the listener moved through the Brotherhood, had gone quiet. And when that goes quiet, what remains is a guild of killers pretending to be a faith. In Cyrodiil specifically, this decline was accelerated by attrition. Members died on contracts and were not replaced. Some left outright, abandoning the Brotherhood for reasons that the journals do not entirely explain but gesture toward. Disillusionment, fear, the pragmatic recognition that belonging to a dying institution offers diminishing returns. The Cyrodiil sanctuary was contracting year by year, and Cicero watched it contract. He watched the people he had come to think of as family reduce in number, watched the ceremonies become shorter and less attended, watched the philosophical architecture of his world lose one load-bearing wall and then another. Through all of this, he remained. He stayed. He took his contracts, fulfilled his tenets, performed his rituals, and believed. What held him was the Night Mother. The Night Mother is one of the most genuinely strange figures in all of Elder Scrolls theology, and it is worth pausing on her for a moment, because understanding her is essential to understanding what Cicero's eventual appointment as her keeper would mean for him. She is described in the lore books available throughout Skyrim as the mortal bride of Sithis, a woman who, in one version of the story, killed her own 5 children as offerings to the void. The children became Sithis's first servants. The Night Mother herself became a kind of conduit between the mortal world and the void, her physical remains preserved and venerated, her spirit capable of speaking to the one person designated to hear her. She is theologically both a god-adjacent figure and a corpse. She is divinity housed in a body that has been dead for a very long time. Lore texts available in Skyrim, and the history contained in the Brotherhood's own traditions, offer one version of her story, and it is a story that rewards careful reading precisely because of how strange it is. The woman who would become the Night Mother was a devotee of Sithis in a time before the Brotherhood existed as an organization, in a time when worship of the void was personal and unstructured. She was not recruited into a cult. She formed the relationship directly, and the consequence of that relationship, the killing of her children, the preservation of her remains, the centuries of service as conduit, was the price of intimacy with something that does not understand mortality the way mortals do. For Cicero, who encountered this story early in his Brotherhood life and never stopped thinking about it, the Night Mother was not a figure of horror. She was a figure of total commitment, a woman who gave everything, including the lives of her children, because her faith demanded it. He recognized something in that. He recognized it very specifically. The Night Mother's physical remains, her mummified body, were the most sacred object in the Brotherhood's possession. Wherever the sanctuary was, she was, and her keeper was responsible for her well-being. The physical care and transportation of a corpse that was simultaneously a vessel of divine power. In the Cyrodiil Brotherhood's later years, before Cicero was assigned to the role, the keeper's position was one of genuine religious significance. It was not glamorous work in the literal sense, but it was sacred work. The Brotherhood understood it as such. Cicero did not become keeper immediately. He was, for much of his active Brotherhood life, simply an assassin. It was only as the Brotherhood continued to decline, and as one by one the people who might have taken on the Keeper's responsibilities either died or departed, that the role came to him. His appointment is recorded in Volume 3 of the Journals, brief and striking. The Black Hand, the Brotherhood's leadership council, named him Keeper. He describes it as an incomprehensible twist of fate, which is the language of a man who is both honored and genuinely surprised. Whatever the logic of the selection, the outcome was the same. But before that appointment happened, there was the contract, there was the Jester, and there was the moment that started everything, the contract that broke him. In the third volume of Cicero's journals, the one that covers his appointment as Keeper and is found among the set in the Falkreath sanctuary, the entry that describes this particular contract is written in a style noticeably different from the entries that surround it. Most of the early journal is relatively composed, given the context. It reads like the work of someone who is beginning to feel the weight of things, but has not yet lost his footing. This entry is different. The handwriting, were we seeing the original, would presumably be different too, because what happened during this contract is the pivot point, the thing that broke something inside Cicero that had never been broken before, and he knows it while he is writing. The contract was simple in its specification. A jester. Someone had paid the Black Sacrament, had sat in a dark room, surrounded a dummy of bones and flesh and nightshade, and stabbed it with a ritual dagger while reciting the words that open communication with the Night Mother's children. To have a jester killed. Cicero does not, in his journals, go into extensive detail about why the jester was targeted, what crime or offense or debt had led someone to make this request. That is not the part of the story he keeps returning to. What he returns to is the jester himself. What he returns to is how the man died, and what Cicero felt watching it happen, and what he did afterward. The jester was, by all available implication, a performer of some kind, someone whose entire public identity was built around making people laugh. He wore the costume, the motley, the bells, the painted face, and when Cicero found him and fulfilled the contract, what he recorded about the experience is brief but haunting. The journal reads simply, "The jester lies dead. My final contract has been completed." Oh, how he laughed and laughed until he didn't. And then, in a later entry, I think back fondly on my hours with the jester, his laughter, his screams, his pitiful cries, and then, as the end drew near, his laughter once more, merry in death as well as in life. This is where the obsession began, not with violence or triumph, but with the image of a man who laughed all the way to the end. Something in that stuck in Cicero and would not let go. The jester did not rage against his death or beg. He laughed. And the more Cicero returned to that memory, alone in the sanctuary, alone with the Night Mother, alone with the silence, the more that laughter filled the space where other sounds used to be. What the journals suggest, in the entries that follow across volumes 3 and 4, is that the persona was not adopted in a single moment, but absorbed gradually, across months and then years of isolation, as the memory of the jester became the primary sound in an otherwise quiet world. By volume 4, Cicero writes that he can hear laughter in his head. A voice from the void, he calls it, a gift from Sithis or the Night Mother to comfort him in the silence. He interprets it as divine. One could also read it as the mind of a very isolated man filling unbearable quiet with the last emotionally vivid sound it retained. The jester's costume, which he does eventually adopt fully, was the outward expression of an inward transformation that had been building for years. The persona was not chosen so much as it arrived piece by piece, until one day it was simply who he was. What the journals make clear is that the transformation happened gradually, not in a single decisive moment. The persona crept in across years of isolation, filling the silence with the memory of a laughing man. By the time the full Jester persona was in place, the costume, the bells, the heightened speech, the laugh that arrived without invitation, it was not a disguise Cicero had chosen, so much as a shape his personality had grown into under pressure. It was the outer form of an inward change, visible evidence of what the years had done to someone with nowhere to go and nothing to sustain him but faith and memory. The Brotherhood was dying. Cicero could see it happening. He had watched colleagues leave, watched the ceremonies thin out, watched the contracts become more mercenary and less sacred. The ideological infrastructure of his world was fracturing around him. And here, in this moment after this contract, he found something that felt like armor, the costume of a man who made the world laugh, worn over the armor of a man trained to make the world grieve. The contradiction is the point. Behind the bells and the paint, you can still be something that people do not see until it is too late. What we can say with reasonable confidence, based on the journal entries and what Cicero's dialogue later reveals, is that the Jester's costume also gave him something to do with the performance that had always been part of his personality. The heightened way he had always spoken, the theatrical self-awareness, the sense of watching himself from slightly outside. The costume gave all of that a form. He did not have to suppress the performance anymore. He could be the performance. And for a while, that worked. For a while, the bells helped him manage what was coming. What was coming was the appointment. What was coming was the silence. What was coming was years. Keeper of the dead. The moment Cicero became keeper of the Night Mother was not a ceremony of triumph. It was, by the evidence of his own writing, something closer to a quiet acknowledgement of inevitability. The Brotherhood in Cyrodiil had contracted to the point where there was almost no one left, and the Night Mother, her mummified remains, the sacred container of the voice that the Brotherhood had been straining to hear for years, still needed to be tended, still needed someone to speak to her, to maintain her, to treat her with the reverence that the tenets demanded. The role fell to Cicero, the way that the last chair in a room always ends up with the last person standing. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the one who stays. Most people, when an institution is collapsing around them, eventually make the rational decision to leave. They assess the structural damage, they weigh their options, and they find the exit. The ones who remain are either those who have nowhere else to go, or those whose commitment is so deep that the institution's survival feels coextensive with their own. Cicero was the latter. He could not leave. The Night Mother was there. Sithis was there, in whatever attenuated way a god is present in the mummified remains of his bride. The tenets were there, still operative in Cicero's understanding, even if no one else was enforcing them. To leave would have been, in his theology, to abandon the divine. And that was not something he was built to do. So he became keeper. And the Night Mother's body, housed in what the game describes as a large black coffin, preserved by whatever arts the Brotherhood brought to bear on such things, became his primary relationship. It is important to be precise about what the keeper's role actually involved, because it sounds, in summary, almost unbearably grim. and the full weight of it is something that the journals convey gradually rather than all at once. The keeper was responsible for the physical care of the Night Mother's remains, ensuring the body was maintained, that the coffin was in good condition, that appropriate rites were observed. The keeper was also responsible for speaking to the Night Mother, not in the expectation of receiving a response through normal channels, since that required a listener, but in the sense of maintaining the relationship, keeping the channel warm, treating the body as the divine vessel it was believed to be rather than the inanimate object it appeared to be. The keeper was the Night Mother's companion, her attendant, her only family, in the absence of the brotherhood that had once surrounded her. In the early months, Cicero treated the role with the seriousness and structure that his character demanded. He kept the coffin clean. He spoke the prayers. He maintained the rites. He reported, in his journals, with a kind of disciplined calm that reads as genuine rather than performed, on his activities and observations. He was, by his own account, a good keeper. He did the job as the tenets specified it should be done. The physical reality of caring for the Night Mother's remains is something that the journals touch on only obliquely. Cicero does not dwell on the more unsettling practical dimensions of the work, possibly because those dimensions were simply part of the job, no more remarkable to him than any other aspect of Brotherhood service. But it is worth understanding that what he was maintaining was a mummified body that had been dead for an extraordinarily long time. The preservation was not natural. The Brotherhood's arts, whatever combination of ritual, alchemical treatment, and Daedric influence, kept the Night Mother's remains intact across the centuries, required ongoing attention. He was not simply guarding a coffin. He was maintaining a very old, very sacred, very singular thing, and the line between reverence and the mundane practicalities of that maintenance was one he had to navigate every day, alone, without any colleague to normalize the strangeness of the task. But the Brotherhood continued to shrink, and the silence from the Night Mother continued, and the Cyrodiil sanctuary, which had once housed a full complement of Brotherhood members across its various chambers and passages, began to feel less like a home and more like a series of empty rooms that Cicero happened to be occupying. He talks about the sounds in the journals, not supernatural sounds. He is not yet at the stage of hearing things that are not there. He talks about the absence of sound, the particular quality of silence in spaces that used to be inhabited, the way footsteps echo differently when there is no ambient noise to absorb them, the way you notice things at the edge of your hearing when there is no one else's breathing to provide background. He describes the sanctuary getting quieter month by month, not as a symbol or a metaphor, but as a literal acoustic experience that he is tracking with the heightened sensory awareness of someone trained to notice environments. This is the beginning, not the madness itself, but the conditions for it. A man with an unusually performative internal life, now without an audience. A man whose entire identity was structured around service to an institution, now the institution's sole representative. A man who had committed himself to a divine presence that was not speaking, in a space that was emptying itself out, with no clear endpoint, and no alternative to simply continuing. He continued. The first journal, Year 1. The 5 journals Cicero leaves in his quarters at the Falkreath sanctuary span what appears to be the better part of a decade, though the dating within them is imprecise. He tracks time by events and seasons rather than years, and as the journals progress, even that tracking becomes less reliable. But the earliest entries, the ones that correspond to what we might reasonably call his first year as keeper in earnest, have a character that is worth dwelling on, because it provides the most direct window into who he was before the isolation fully took hold. He writes clearly in the early volumes. The syntax is complex but not fractured. He uses full sentences, organized paragraphs. He reports on contracts he has taken, because he was still working as an assassin even while serving as keeper. The Brotherhood's remaining contracts still needed to be fulfilled, and there were few enough bodies left to fulfill them that Cicero was taking work regularly. He describes targets with the professional detachment of someone who has been doing this work for a long time. He describes his own methods with the same quality. There is something almost clinical about these early entries, a precision that reads as the expression of a disciplined mind. What interrupts the clinical quality from the very first journal is the Night Mother. Not because she does anything, not because she speaks or moves or gives any signal that would justify attention. She does none of those things. What interrupts the clinical quality of the journals is Cicero's reporting of his conversations with her, which are, in the early entries, structured as one-sided but not irrational. He tells her about his day. He describes the contract he has just completed. He reports on the state of the sanctuary, what maintenance was done, what needs doing next. He asks her questions, not with the expectation of answers, but in the way that someone performing religious practice speaks into the space of the divine, with the understanding that the direction of transmission matters even when confirmation is uncertain. This is not madness, this is devotion. A priest speaks to God without expecting audible response. A monk maintains prayers without confirmation that they land anywhere. Cicero, speaking to the Night Mother in the early journals, is entirely consistent with the theological framework he has always operated within. The question is not whether the practice is sane. The question is what happens to the practice when the conditions around it change and keep changing and never improve. By the end of what appears to be the first year, the journal entries have shifted in small but measurable ways. The clinical descriptions of contracts begin to be interrupted by passages about the Night Mother that run longer than they did before. The balance of content shifts, less about the external world of assassination and Brotherhood business, more about the conversations with the body in the coffin. And the conversations themselves have started to change register slightly. They are less like reports and more like confessions. He is telling her things he would not tell a colleague or a superior, or anyone he needed to maintain a professional face in front of. He is telling her about his fears, not dramatic fears, not the supernatural terrors that will come later. In the early journals, what he tells her about is the ordinary and specifically terrible fear that he is not sure anyone is paying attention, that the tenets he follows are real and sacred and binding, but that the institution built around them is failing, and that he does not know what it means for the tenets if the institution fails completely, that he believes in Sithis and in the Night Mother and in the sacred structure of the Brotherhood's contract with the void, and that he does not know what happens to a belief when there is no one left who shares it except the believer. These are not the ravings of a broken man. They are the coherent and deeply sad reflections of a thoughtful person whose world is narrowing, who is beginning to sense that he may be the last person in a room that was not meant to hold only one person, asking the only presence available to him for something. Reassurance, response, confirmation that he has no expectation of receiving. The Night Mother does not respond. He continues. The silence stretches. If the first journal documents the beginning of Cicero's vigil, the volumes that follow it document its intensification. What changes across the span of multiple journals is not the basic situation. He is still the keeper, still alone or nearly alone, still in the Cyrodiil sanctuary, still speaking to the Night Mother without response, but the quality of his relationship to that situation. In the early journals, he is maintaining himself against the isolation. In the later journals, the isolation is maintaining him, which is to say, it has become the primary structure of his experience, the frame within which everything else occurs. The number of people in the Cyrodiil sanctuary continues to diminish. He names them in the journals, and those names begin to disappear from subsequent entries with a regularity that is difficult to read without feeling the accumulation of it. Someone dies on a contract. Someone else leaves without explanation. A third person is there one entry and absent the next, with only a brief note suggesting they departed. Each departure is documented matter-of-factly, in keeping with the professional ethos of the Brotherhood, but the matter-of-factness is increasingly unconvincing. By the time the sanctuary is down to a small handful of people, the journal entries about these departures are shorter, not longer, as though he has learned that writing more does not help and has reduced himself to the minimum acknowledgement that the loss requires. The Night Mother becomes, in this period, something more than a devotional object. She becomes his primary interlocutor. This is not a dramatic shift that happens all at once. It happens gradually, across months of entries, as the social world around Cicero contracts and the relationship with the Night Mother expands to fill the space left behind. He begins reporting to her not just at the end of a day, not just in formal prayer, but continuously, mid-thought, mid-task, the way you might speak to someone who is always in the room with you, who you have stopped making special occasions to address because they are always there. And then a thing happens that changes the journal's tone more dramatically than anything previous. Somewhere in the middle of this period, the exact timing is difficult to establish. Cicero begins to report that the Night Mother is speaking to him. This needs to be handled carefully, because the truth of the matter is one of the most interesting narrative complications in Cicero's story. Is she? By the time the player of Skyrim reaches the Dark Brotherhood questline, the answer is clearly yes. The Night Mother does speak, does have a listener. The spiritual mechanics of the Brotherhood's theology are real and operative. So Cicero's eventual claim to hear the Night Mother is not demonstrably wrong. But what the journals suggest, particularly the earlier references to communication, is that the nature of that communication is ambiguous, and that Cicero himself, even in the depth of his belief, is not entirely certain of what he is experiencing. He writes about feelings, not words, a sense of presence, a quality of the air near the coffin that seems different from the air elsewhere in the sanctuary, a conviction arriving not from outside but from somewhere inside him, that the Night Mother is aware of him and not displeased with his service. He interprets these as contact. They could be contact. They could also be the mind of a very isolated person, beginning to fill the silence with something that feels like response, because the alternative, that there is only silence, that his entire context of meaning is built on a presence that does not acknowledge him, is too large to hold. There is no definitive way to adjudicate this. The game does not provide one. What the game provides instead is the texture of a man who needs the contact to be real, whose capacity to continue depends on the contact being real, and who is therefore interpreting his experience in the way that sustains him. Whether the Night Mother speaks to Cicero in these middle journal years, or whether he is constructing the communication from the raw material of his own longing, the functional result is the same. He stays, he keeps, He maintains the rights. He goes on. What the silence years do to him, measurably, documentably in the journals, is shift his relationship to time. In the early entries, time moves. Events happen. Contracts are fulfilled. Things change. In the later journals of this period, time begins to feel different. The entries become more repetitive, not in a mechanical way, but in the way that days become repetitive when they lack external structure. He describes the same rituals across multiple entries with the same language, not because he is being careless, but because the ritual itself has become the full content of the day, and the day has no other distinguishing characteristics. He has not lost his grip on time. He has lost the things that made time feel distinguished, and without those, the sameness of days starts to show up in the prose. This is the period in which the laugh begins to appear in the journals, not described as a symptom, not flagged by Cicero himself as something troubling. It simply begins to show up. Notes that he found himself laughing, not at anything in particular, during a quiet moment in the sanctuary. Notes that the laugh, once started, continued for a while. Notes that it felt, in the moment, like a relief. This is the laugh that will eventually become legendary, uncontrollable, unsettling, the signature sound of the mad jester. But at its origin, in the journals, it is simply a pressure valve, a way that a body under enormous sustained strain was releasing something that needed releasing. The laugh at this stage is not madness, it is the precursor to it. What the journals track across the following months is the gradual shift from voluntary to involuntary. In the first entries where the laugh appears, it arrives and then stops, and the entry continues. In later entries, he notes that it went on for a while before he could collect himself. In later ones still, he stops noting it at all, not because it has stopped, but because it has become part of the background, part of how he sounds to himself, no more remarkable than the sound of his own breathing. By the time he is writing the later journals, the laugh is simply him. The bells ring when he moves, and he laughs when the strain becomes too much. And together, these sounds comprise Cicero in the way that a person's voice and cadence comprise them. He has not lost himself entirely. He has acquired a new texture, a new register, and it is one that was forged in silence rather than chosen. The jester's costume. By this point in Cicero's story, the jester's persona he had gradually absorbed in the years following that final contract was no longer simply an affectation or a piece of professional armor. It had become, across the years of isolation and service, something closer to a second identity, or perhaps more precisely, the outer expression of an inner state that he no longer had adequate words for. The jester's bells and motley, the painted face, the heightened performance of absurdity, these were the form that his particular psychology had found for itself during the years in which the only audience for that psychology was a woman who had been dead for centuries. There is a specific and somewhat strange comfort in the costume, if you think about it from inside Cicero's situation. The jester figure, historically, and in the Elder Scrolls world alike, occupies a liminal position. The jester is inside the court, but not of the court. The jester is permitted to say things that others cannot, to perform what others must conceal, to be visibly strange in spaces where everyone else must perform normalcy. There is a freedom in the jester's role that is unavailable to people who must maintain conventional presentations of self. And for someone in Cicero's position, someone whose faith was real, but whose institution had disintegrated, whose career was ongoing, but whose context for that career was collapsing. The Jester's freedom to be visibly outside the norm was not nothing. It was possibly the only honest presentation available to him. He did not adopt the persona out of madness. He was absorbed into it as the madness arrived. And what the costume did, as the madness arrived, was provide a container for the increasingly fragmented quality of his self-presentation. The persona of the jester, the laugh, the theatrical diction, the exaggerated physicality, absorbed the cracks. When Cicero giggled in the middle of a sentence, it was the jester giggling. When Cicero spiraled into extended philosophical tangents about Sithis and the void, it was the jester's heightened register, rendering those spirals as performance rather than breakdown. The costume protected him, in the sense that it gave an external form to his internal disintegration that read as intentional rather than inevitable. This is one of the most interesting things about Cicero, and one of the things that makes him such a strange figure to encounter in the game. He is genuinely funny, not in spite of the madness, but in some complicated relationship with it. The heightened theatrical register that the isolation produced turns out to be, in practice, quite entertaining. He has timing. He has genuine wit. His observations about the people around him, about the Dragonborn, about the state of the Brotherhood, are often incisive and occasionally brilliant. The jester's license to be absurd gave his intelligence a form it had not previously had, and even inside the wreckage of who he used to be, that intelligence operates. But beneath the bells across the years in the sanctuary, the man wearing the costume is deteriorating. He is alone with the corpse he believes is divine. He is performing rituals for a faith whose community has evaporated. He is an assassin with diminishing contracts and diminishing context for why the contracts matter. He is maintaining himself through a structure of belief and practice that exists now primarily in his own mind, which is the loneliest possible way to maintain a structure. And the laugh, which started as a pressure valve, has become something less voluntary over time, something that arrives on its own schedule, that interrupts thoughts and sentences and prayers, that he increasingly has to work around rather than deploy. The journals in this period have a quality that is difficult to describe precisely, but feels important. They are not the records of someone who has lost touch with reality. They are the records of someone who has reorganized his relationship to reality around a set of priorities that the world around him does not share. He knows the Brotherhood is nearly gone. He knows the Night Mother has not spoken in the way that the Tenets say she should speak. He knows on some level that the version of himself he is presenting to the empty sanctuary is not the version he started with. What he does not do in the journals is conclude from any of this that his fundamental beliefs are wrong. He concludes, instead, that the situation is wrong, and that the situation needs to change, and that his job is to find a way to change it. This is the logic that eventually moves him north, fleeing south to north. The decision to leave Cyrodiil did not come suddenly. If the journals are to be read as a continuous record, and there is good reason to think they are, despite the gaps and the increasingly fragmented quality of later entries, then the idea of relocating had been present for a significant time before it became action. What made it action was the sequence of events that the journals describe in their later Cyrodiil-era entries: the final deaths or departures of the remaining Brotherhood members, the escalating deterioration of the sanctuary itself, and a specific exchange with an authority figure of the Brotherhood whose identity is somewhat obscured in Cicero's telling, but whose message was unmistakable. He was told, in terms that the journal renders with a mixture of wounded disbelief and seething resentment, that the Night Mother needed to be moved. that the Cyrodiil sanctuary was no longer viable, that the Night Mother's remains should go to Skyrim, where what remained of the Brotherhood's northern chapter was still operative. The final volume of the journals makes clear that Cicero initially wrote letters to Astrid, formally, so polite, so official, as the journal puts it. But on the sea crossing, he reconsidered. He found a reference to the ancient Dawnstar sanctuary and resolved to go there first, on his own terms, rather than arrive as a supplicant to Astrid's chapter. This instruction, to move north, came not as a comfort, but as a confirmation of what Cicero already knew and had been resisting knowing, that the Cyrodiil Brotherhood was finished, that the long decline he had been witnessing and documenting was not a cycle heading toward recovery, but a terminal trajectory, that the Cheydinhal sanctuary he had served in for years, the sanctuary that had been the Night Mother's home and his home, was done. He prepared for the journey with the thoroughness that his training demanded. He organized the Night Mother's coffin for transport, settled what remained of the sanctuary's affairs, and made arrangements to leave Cyrodiil. The final journal makes clear how he traveled, by sea. The entry reads, with characteristic Cicero cadence, "Tomorrow we set sail. Float on a boat through the moat, called the sea, her and me." The next entry records him on the water, sick from the crossing. Sick, sick, sick of the rocking, tossing, rolling, throwing upon the grey waves. This is a detail worth sitting with. The Night Mother, in a heavy stone coffin, transported across open water by a single man who was seasick and talking to her the entire time. He was already deep into the persona by this point. The handwriting in the final volume is the fractured, rhyming, third-person speech of someone fully absorbed by the Jester's register. But he was also still doing the job, getting the coffin where it needed to go. On that crossing, he read about Skyrim. He read about the old days, the old ways, and he found a reference to something he had not previously known about. An ancient Dawnstar sanctuary, one of the first Brotherhood strongholds in Skyrim, described as good, strong, and blessed by Sithis. His plan crystallized on that boat. He would not go to Astrid. He would go to Dawnstar, the Night Mother, and he would settle there. And she would finally speak, and they would rebuild the old ways together, without needing anyone else's permission. But the journey north was also, by this point, a journey being made by a man who was not entirely well. The isolation of the later Cyrodiil years had done its work. The laugh was less controllable than it had been. The journal entries from the road have a quality of fracture to them. There are sentence-level inconsistencies, tonal shifts mid-paragraph, moments where the record drops into the heightened theatrical voice of the Jester persona and stays there for longer than seems deliberate. He was still Cicero. He was still capable of navigating the practical challenges of the journey. But the person navigating those challenges was no longer the same person who had begun the Keeper's Vigil, and the journals reflect that whether or not he intended them to. What the journals consistently show, across every phase of his story, is that wherever the Night Mother was, Cicero was in conversation with her. There is no reason to think the journey was any different. He had been speaking to her daily for years before the road north began, and the road gave him nothing else to do between stops. Based on the pattern established across all 5 volumes, it is reasonable to assume those conversations continued throughout the transit. The same devotion, just in motion. He reassured her with a conviction that at this point in the journals reads as something he was also partly reassuring himself with, that he would get her to Skyrim safely, that the Brotherhood in Skyrim would honor her as she deserved, that everything was going to be different once they arrived. He believed this. It is important to understand that he believed it. He was not performing optimism. The journey north was, in his theological framework, a pilgrimage, a sacred transit from one home to another, with the promise of arrival at a place where the Night Mother's voice would finally be heard, where the Brotherhood would be restored to its proper function, where Cicero's decade of faithful service would be recognized and the silence would end. He had sustained himself on the belief that if he just kept going, if he just maintained the vigil, if he just did his job, eventually everything would align. Skyrim was supposed to be that alignment. The road to Skyrim. Once in Skyrim, Cicero needed to move the Night Mother's coffin overland, and for that, he needed a wagon. Exactly where he acquired one, the journals do not specify, but what they do record is what happened to it. The wheel broke. He was on the road north of Whiterun when it happened, near a farm called Lorius Farm, stranded with the Night Mother's coffin on a public road with no immediate means of resolving the situation. He could not leave the coffin unattended. He could not move it alone without the wagon. He needed help, and in his situation, the Jester's costume, the conspicuous cargo, the somewhat unnerving quality of his general presentation. Obtaining help was not a simple matter of asking. This is incidentally where the player first encounters Cicero, on the road near Lorius Farm, next to the broken wagon, asking for assistance. A farmer named Vantus Lorius owned the land nearby. Cicero had apparently already approached him multiple times before the player encounters the scene. The game's dialogue has Lorius complaining that the strange Jester had asked him 5 times already. The farmer's resistance was not cruelty but wariness. A man in a Jester's costume transporting an enormous coffin and claiming it contained his deceased mother was not, by any reasonable standard, someone you trusted on sight. Cicero's answer to the question of what was in the coffin, that it was his mother, was both a deflection and, in his theology, entirely true. This is, depending on your perspective, either a lie or a deeply sincere statement. The Night Mother was, in his theological framework, exactly what he claimed. He was the keeper. She was his charge, his obligation, the sacred center of everything he had devoted his adult life to. If she was not his mother in a biological sense, she was his mother in every sense that his worldview recognized. He told the farming family she was his mother, and he was not entirely wrong. Lorius did eventually help. In the game, if the player convinces him, he repairs the wheel. The journal records the resolution with something that is almost festive. A brief lifting of the tone that suggests Cicero was genuinely relieved, genuinely grateful, and possibly moved by the ordinary kindness of strangers who had no reason to help a strange man with a strange cargo, and did so anyway. He writes about the encounter in subsequent entries. He clearly thought about it. In a life that had been structured around the Brotherhood's specific and insular community for so long, encountering someone who was simply a person, who had a farm and ordinary concerns, who helped a strange man on the road because it was eventually a reasonable thing to do, landed on him with a force that the journals suggest he did not entirely expect. There is something quietly heartbreaking about this moment in the full context of his story. He had spent years in a sanctuary that had emptied itself out person by person, years in which the social world had contracted to the point where his primary relationship was with a woman who could not respond, and then a farmer with no knowledge of the Brotherhood, no awareness of what was in the coffin, no investment in any of it beyond eventual ordinary decency helped him. They asked no complicated questions. They extended him ordinary human consideration, and he carried the memory of it forward through the rest of the journey and into the early Dawnstar entries, returning to it in ways that are out of proportion to the size of the event. A repaired wheel, a stranger's ordinary decency. To someone who had been isolated as long as Cicero had, it was something close to restoration. The final volume records his arrival with something that functions as relief, if not quite joy. The Dawnstar Sanctuary, when he reached it, was as he had hoped. Ancient, cool, dark, and his. He settled in. He described knowing every corner, every hall. For a brief moment, the journals have a quality close to contentment. The Night Mother was housed. He had a space of his own. He waited for her to speak. She did not, immediately. By the 13th of First Seed, 4E201, the silence had returned. The entry reads, "The silence has returned. Now that I am laughter, and no longer hear laughter, I once again hear the silence." And then, just weeks later, a final resolution in the last entry of the final volume. "I am not the listener, and never will be, but I am the keeper. I must serve my mother's will above my own. I must find her listener." That is what sent him to Astrid's sanctuary after all. Not a plan abandoned, but a conclusion reached. If the Night Mother was going to find her listener, she needed to be where people were. The Dawnstar Sanctuary was too isolated even for that purpose. He had to go to Falkreath. He had to go where the Brotherhood was, however imperfect that Brotherhood might be. He arrived eventually at the Falkreath Sanctuary. Inside the Falkreath Sanctuary. The Falkreath Sanctuary is the one Cicero brings the Night Mother to. The operational chapter, the one with actual living members, the one run by Astrid. It sits behind a black door in the pine forests south of Falkreath, and like all Brotherhood sanctuaries, it is accessible only through the correct ritual passphrase. Cicero knew it. He was Brotherhood. He was the Night Mother's keeper. He had more right than almost anyone alive to stand at that black door and have it open for him. What he found inside was not what he had hoped for. The Falkreath Sanctuary, by the time Cicero arrived, was operational but not thriving. The Brotherhood chapter there was functional. There were members, there were contracts, there was a working kitchen and sleeping quarters, and the basic infrastructure of a sanctuary doing its job. But it was, by the account implied in the journals and in the dialogue of the members you encounter there during the main quest line, a chapter that had accommodated the Night Mother's silence and was not sure what to do with a keeper who had arrived to challenge that accommodation. There was Arnbjorn, there was Babette, there was Festus Krex, there was Nazir, and there was Astrid. Each of them is worth noting briefly, because each of them represents a different kind of relationship to what Cicero was carrying when he arrived. Arnbjorn was a werewolf, and Astrid's husband, a warrior who had come to the Brotherhood through Astrid's influence rather than through formal invitation, and who had no particular patience for theological debate. Babette was the child vampire who had been a Brotherhood member for centuries, and whose relationship to the Tenets was one of historical familiarity rather than active devotion. Festus Krex was an older mage, caustic and competent, who regarded the Brotherhood's spiritual architecture as interesting background noise behind the actual work. And Nazir was, by his own understated presentation, simply a professional, someone who took contracts, fulfilled them, and maintained a consistent opinion that most of the Brotherhood's internal arguments were not worth the breath they consumed. None of them were hostile to Cicero exactly, but none of them were his people in the sense that the Cyrodiil Brotherhood had been his people. They did not share his investment in the Night Mother's primacy. They had organized themselves around other things, and his arrival did not reorganize them. Astrid was, by the time Cicero arrived, the effective leader of the Skyrim chapter. She had no formal title that invoked the Brotherhood's traditional hierarchy. She was not listener. She was not speaker in the traditional sense. But she led, and the other members followed her, and the sanctuary functioned according to her authority. This authority was not corrupt in the way that Mercer Frey's authority in the Thieves' Guild was corrupt. Astrid was not embezzling from the Brotherhood or systematically betraying its interests for personal gain. She had simply filled the leadership vacuum created by the Night Mother's silence with something practical. Her own judgment, her own rules, her own sense of what the Brotherhood should be. And in the absence of divine instruction from above, practical leadership was not unreasonable. The problem, from Cicero's perspective, was that Astrid's version of the Brotherhood did not leave much room for the Night Mother's primacy. Astrid's Brotherhood took contracts through conventional channels, managed its members through interpersonal authority, and operated as what it had functionally become: a guild of skilled assassins with a spiritual backstory that was treated as tradition rather than active theology. She respected the Night Mother's remains. She was not hostile to their presence, but she was not oriented toward them the way that Cicero was, and his arrival with the coffin and his decade of accumulated ferocity about proper Brotherhood practice was, at best, an awkward addition to her sanctuary. The journals document this friction with a precision that is both revealing and slightly painful to read. Cicero observed Astrid's leadership and found it wanting, not because she was incompetent. He is never quite that uncharitable in the early Skyrim entries, but because she had reorganized the Brotherhood around herself rather than around the Night Mother. And that reorganization was, in his theology, an inversion of the correct order. The Night Mother was the center. The listener served the Night Mother. The rest of the Brotherhood served the listener. A Brotherhood organized around a human leader with no connection to the divine source was, from Cicero's perspective, a Brotherhood that had quietly stopped being the Brotherhood in any meaningful sense. He said so, in ways that were perhaps not entirely diplomatic. The journals record several instances of conflict, verbal altercations, philosophical debates that were not actually debates, because neither party was willing to yield any ground. Between Cicero and various sanctuary members, Astrid received the sharpest edge of his critique. She received it with the patience of someone who had learned to manage difficult personalities, and she maintained a superficially functional relationship with him. But the journals make clear that what was happening underneath that functional relationship was something closer to a standoff. Cicero with his theology and his coffin and his years of solitary vigil. Astrid with her practical authority and her assembled family of killers, neither able to simply remove the other. The sanctuary itself was a place Cicero found oddly suitable. Despite the tensions, despite the unresolved question of authority, the physical space, the underground rooms, the black walls, the pine-muffled quiet overhead, the quality of silence that Brotherhood sanctuaries always cultivated, was a space he recognized as appropriate. The Night Mother's coffin was installed in the central chamber. Cicero attended to her. He kept up the rites. He continued his conversations. And here, in the Falkreath sanctuary, the journals take on a quality they had not quite had before, a kind of agitation. Not desperation exactly, but urgency. He had arrived where he was supposed to be. He was doing what he was supposed to do. And still, the Night Mother was silent. Still, the Brotherhood operated without a listener. Still, Astrid managed everything through personal authority. He had held the vigil through Cyrodiil's collapse. He had transported the body across the continent. He had done everything that the Tenets asked of him, everything that his faith demanded. And the reward was more of the same silence he had been enduring for years, now in a new building with new people who did not particularly want him there. The laugh in the Falkreath era journal entries is inescapable. It appears in nearly every entry. Sometimes he notes it. Sometimes it simply appears in the middle of a sentence as a disruption, and the sentence continues as though the disruption had not occurred. He is not always aware of it anymore, or he is aware of it but has lost the ability to be surprised by it. It is simply part of him now, part of the register in which he exists, as much as the bells and the motley and the particular way he has of watching people that makes them feel simultaneously seen and evaluated. What the Night Mother said, and then, after everything, after the years of solitude and the long silences and the journey north and the friction of the Falkreath sanctuary and the journals piling up with their accumulated record of devotion and deterioration, the Night Mother spoke. Not to Cicero. This is perhaps the most painful single fact in Cicero's entire story, and the game delivers it with a matter-of-factness that somehow makes it worse rather than better. The Night Mother, when she finally breaks her silence, breaks it not to the keeper who has spent more than a decade in devoted attendance, not to the man who has maintained her body and spoken to her every day and transported her across the continent and argued with an entire sanctuary on her behalf and held his faith together through conditions that would have dissolved most people's faith entirely. She speaks to the Dragonborn. She speaks to someone who has just arrived. She speaks to someone who, from Cicero's perspective, has done precisely nothing to earn the contact. The game's Dark Brotherhood questline brings the player into the sanctuary and eventually into the Night Mother's coffin. The player actually climbs inside the coffin during a ritual, stands in the dark with the mummified remains, and hears her speak. She identifies the Dragonborn as the listener. She gives her first contract in what is implied to be a very long time, and then she announces, through the mechanism of this new listener, who the listener is. Cicero's response to this in the game is one of the most genuinely affecting moments in Skyrim's writing. He is not devastated. He is overjoyed. He is overwhelmingly, tearfully, laughingly overjoyed, in a way that is at once funny and heartbreaking and deeply revealing of who he has always been underneath everything else. He falls to his knees. He laughs his uncontrollable laugh. He weeps, or something that functions as weeping. He thanks Sithis. He thanks the Night Mother. He thanks the player, the new listener, the person to whom the message that he has been waiting years to receive was finally delivered. Because this is the thing about Cicero that the game ultimately reveals. He was right. He was right about everything. The Night Mother was real and capable of speaking. The listener was a real role that a real person would be called to fill. The Brotherhood's abandonment of its theological structure in favor of Astrid's practical leadership was, exactly as he had been insisting for years, the wrong direction. His theology was not a symptom of his madness. His madness was a consequence of having the right theology in the wrong circumstances, of being correct about the divine mechanics of his world, while the world around him refused to participate in those mechanics. He was not broken by being wrong. He was broken by being right for too long, with no one to confirm it. Think about what that actually means from inside his experience. He maintained a position, that the Night Mother was real, that the listener was a real role that would one day be filled, that the Brotherhood's spiritual structure was not optional decoration, but the actual load-bearing architecture of what the organization was. for years in the face of consistent evidence that nobody around him agreed. Astrid ran the sanctuary according to her own authority, and it worked. The contracts came in, the targets died, the Brotherhood continued. The practical case against Cicero's theology was strong, because the practical case is always strong. Things were functioning without divine input, so why insist on divine input? And yet he was right, and the functioning without divine input was, in the longest view, a temporary condition. He had the longer view. He just also had the shorter years, and the shorter years were the ones he had to live in. This is what makes Cicero unique among Skyrim's most interesting NPCs. His tragedy is not the tragedy of a deluded person crashing against reality. It is the tragedy of a real person crashing against a world that was not ready to validate his reality. The laugh, the costume, the years of talking to a corpse, all of it wasn't madness in the sense of disconnection from what is true. It was madness in the sense of a person pushed past their sustainable limits by circumstances that would have broken almost anyone, while simultaneously being absolutely correct about the things that mattered most to them. When the Night Mother speaks through the player, when the Dragonborn becomes the listener that Cicero has been waiting for, there is a resolution to the theological crisis that has structured his story. The machinery works. The Brotherhood's divine connection is restored. Cicero's faith is vindicated in the most literal possible way. The body he has been caring for and speaking to and transporting and arguing on behalf of for years and years was, in fact, capable of speech, was, in fact, divine, was, in fact, worth every one of the years he gave to her. In the journals left in the Falkreath sanctuary, he does not write about this moment. The journals end before it, but the final entries, the ones with the most fractured syntax, the ones where the laugh appears mid-sentence most frequently, the ones where his theology and his loneliness are most fully intertwined. Those entries now read differently, knowing what is coming. They read like the end of a very long night, just before a dawn he has no way of knowing is about to arrive. His fate in your hands. Before the Night Mother speaks, before the theological resolution, there is a crisis in the Falkreath sanctuary that puts Cicero's fate directly in the player's hands. And the crisis is, like everything in Cicero's story, deeply rooted in the tension between his theological commitments and Astrid's practical authority. The specifics of what happens depend on which quests you pursue and in what order. But the central dynamic is this: Cicero's insistence on the Night Mother's primacy, his refusal to subordinate his faith to Astrid's leadership, his increasingly erratic behavior within the sanctuary. All of this builds to a breaking point. The breaking point, when it comes, is violent. Cicero wounds Arnbjorn. He flees the sanctuary and heads north, deeper into Skyrim, ultimately reaching the Falkreath sanctuary, the abandoned one, the one that the player is given the opportunity to restore, and hiding there in the darkness. Astrid sends you after him. She wants him dead. She frames this as a practical necessity. He has wounded Visera, tried to kill Astrid, and become a liability. The sanctuary cannot contain him anymore. And she is not entirely wrong in the practical sense. The Cicero who is hiding in the abandoned Dawnstar sanctuary, the one you find and confront, is operating at the furthest edge of his remaining coherence. He has been pushed past every limit. The laugh in the dialogue during this confrontation is essentially continuous. He is fully the Jester now, the bells and the madness fully integrated. The careful professional of the early journals essentially invisible beneath everything that the years have deposited on top of him. And yet, in this confrontation, something breaks through. He talks to you, not in the way that a cornered animal attacks out of fear, but in the way that Cicero has always talked, with the theatrical heightening, with the conviction that what he is saying matters, with the specific and strange directness that has always characterized his relationship to people he considers worth addressing. He does not beg. He argues. He insists that he has been faithful. He insists that the Night Mother's cause is just and that he has served it without compromise, and that this, being hunted by the people he considers his own family, is what that faithfulness has earned him. The Dawn Star Sanctuary, where this confrontation happens, is described in the journal's final volume as an ancient or long-abandoned Brotherhood stronghold that Cicero had read about. One of the first sanctuaries in Skyrim, unused for nearly a century. He did not flee there randomly. He had been planning it. The final journal volume contains the passphrase to enter it, finding Cicero inside it, in the dark of a space that was once sacred and is now disused, carries a particular resonance if you have read the journals. He is a keeper hiding in an empty sanctuary, which is precisely what he has always been, just more literally now. He is in costume, in the bells, in the ancient dark of a place that has not housed living Brotherhood members in generations. He has his blades. He is not cornered in the animal sense. He is coherent enough to know exactly what is happening, and exactly what the arrival of a dragonborn sent by Astrid is likely to mean. His speech, when you find him, is not confused. It is clear and direct and sad, in a way the laugh does not successfully mask. You can kill him. The game permits it. Astrid has told you to, and the mechanics of the questline at this stage invite it. If you kill him, he dies as he has lived, in service to the Night Mother, in the Brotherhood's colors, in the Jester's costume. It is not a redemptive death. It is simply the end of a life that had already given everything it had to give. The journals remain in the sanctuary, available for anyone to read. The full record of a man who was always doing what he understood to be right and was broken by the gap between his understanding and his circumstances. But you can also spare him. And if you spare him, the game gives you something worth having. Because if Cicero lives, and if you later become the listener, the thing that Cicero's entire story has been oriented toward, he becomes your companion. He becomes available as a follower. He walks beside you through Skyrim with his bells and his laugh, and his absolute conviction that you are the most important person in the world, not because you are powerful or skilled or impressive, but because you are the listener, because the Night Mother chose you, because the theological machinery finally, after all this time, is working the way it was always supposed to work. He is not healed exactly. He is still Cicero, still the Jester, still the laugh, still the heightened register, still the particular strangeness that comes from more than a decade of isolation and grief. But there is something in the companion dialogue, in the way he talks to you when you travel together, that suggests a man who has found something he had genuinely given up hope of finding. Someone who fits the role that makes his own role make sense. The keeper needs a listener. For years there was no listener. Now there is. Now the structure is complete. He follows you with an intensity that is, in its own strange way, one of the most touching things in Skyrim. He is not following you because he has been commanded to, not following you out of servitude or obligation. He is following you because you are the theological partner he has waited for through years that cost him nearly everything. His devotion to you as listener is of a piece with his devotion to the Night Mother. Total, literal, without reserve. There is a line, he says, traveling with the player, that the journals contextualize in a way that makes it land differently than it would on first encounter. He says, in one of his companion dialogues that he will never stop, that wherever you go, he will follow, that he will protect the listener with everything he has for as long as he has anything left to give. On first encounter, this reads as comedic intensity. The little jester with the bells, swearing eternal fealty. But inside the full context of the journals, inside the story of the years he spent believing and maintaining and waiting, it is just true. It is simply true. He means every word of it. He has always meant everything he has ever said about his faith, and you are now the living expression of that faith, and he will not leave you. The Night Mother's coffin remains in the Dawnstar Sanctuary. If you have completed the quest line and spared Cicero and become the listener, you can return there any time. The coffin is in the central chamber where Cicero installed it. He is available to summon there, to travel from there, to continue from there into whatever you want to do next. The journals are on the shelves, available to read in sequence, the full record of the years. And somewhere in that record, if you read it from the beginning, the clear early entries, the careful reports, the professional pride in craft, the gradually increasing weight of the silence, the laugh appearing for the first time, the long middle years of isolation and devotion, the journey north, the sanctuary tension, the waiting. Somewhere in all of that, there is a shape of what it costs to believe in something when the world is not cooperating with your belief. What it takes to maintain a sacred trust when everyone else has let theirs go. What a person becomes, and what they lose, and what survives when faith is the only structure left. Cicero survived, badly and strangely, and at enormous personal cost, but he survived. He kept her safe. He got her here. And in the end, against all available evidence that he should have given up, the Night Mother spoke. The tenets he carried. Among the things that Cicero preserved across the collapse of the Cyrodiil Brotherhood and the long years of the vigil, the tenets of the Dark Brotherhood deserve a separate accounting, because they are not simply a background detail to his story. They are the architecture of it. They are the reason he stayed when others left. They are the framework within which every decision he made, every sacrifice he absorbed, every year he gave had meaning. To understand Cicero's story fully is to understand what the tenets meant to him, not abstractly, but in the specific terms of how they governed his days. The tenets of the Dark Brotherhood, as they existed in the organization's traditional form, were a set of binding rules that operated something like a sacred contract between the individual assassin and the Brotherhood as a whole. They were not arbitrary policies. They were theological commitments, understood as expressions of Sithis' will, as mediated through the Night Mother. Breaking a tenet was not just a disciplinary failure. It was apostasy. It was the severing of the divine connection that made the Brotherhood's work something other than ordinary murder. The most significant tenets in practice concerned the prohibition against killing fellow Brotherhood members. You did not kill a brother or sister. You did not steal from them. You did not disobey a direct order from the leadership structure, the listener, the speakers, the keeper. You did not fail to fulfill a contract once accepted. These were the pillars, and the consequences of violating them were known to every member as the wrath of Sithis, the belief that transgression would bring divine retribution, that Sithis would send his children to collect the debt owed by the person who had broken faith. For Cicero, the tenets were not experienced as external constraints. They were internal. They were the structure of his conscience. When the Brotherhood around him began to disintegrate, when members left without completing their obligations, when the institutional architecture of the organization began to fail, What Cicero experienced was not liberation from constraint, but profound disorientation. The tenets were the map. Without them, you were not free. You were lost. He continued to observe them regardless. When there was no one to hold him accountable, he held himself accountable. When there was no speaker to receive reports, he wrote reports in his journals. When there was no ritual audience for the prayers, he performed them for the Night Mother. He treated the tenets as binding, not because they were enforced, but because they were true, and the truth of them did not depend on institutional enforcement. This is, one interpretation suggests, an admirable quality in a person. It is also one of the qualities that made his isolation so devastating, because the tenets were designed for a community, and he was observing them alone. In the Falkreath sanctuary, the tension between Cicero's tenet observance and Astrid's leadership comes into focus around precisely this question of legitimacy. Astrid was not operating within the traditional Brotherhood hierarchy. She had not been appointed by a listener or a speaker. She led because she was capable and present, and because the others followed her, which is a perfectly adequate basis for practical authority, but is not, in the Brotherhood's theological framework, the same as legitimate authority. Cicero's objection to her leadership was not personal animosity, though personal animosity developed. His objection was theological. She was operating outside the chain of divine command, and the Brotherhood she was running was therefore, by his understanding, not quite the Brotherhood at all. This is why, when the Night Mother finally speaks and the listener is designated, Cicero's relief is not just personal, but structural. The chain of command is restored. The tenets can be properly observed because the authority structure that the tenets presuppose has been reactivated. He is no longer alone in his observance, no longer maintaining a structure that no one else recognizes, no longer the single remaining participant in a ceremony that requires multiple roles. The restoration of the listener restores the Brotherhood, and the restoration of the Brotherhood restores the meaning of everything Cicero has done in its service. There is a detail worth noting about the tenets, as they apply specifically to the Dragonborn's experience of the Brotherhood in Skyrim. The questline explicitly names the tenets and frames their observance as a measure of Brotherhood standing. But it also, in the character of Astrid, presents an alternative to tenet-based leadership that the narrative does not entirely condemn. Astrid cares about her people. She is not running the Brotherhood for personal enrichment. She has built a family of sorts in the sanctuary, and her decisions, including the decision to send the player after Cicero, are made within a framework of protecting that family. The fact that her framework is not the correct theological one does not make her motivation cynical. This is part of what makes the Brotherhood questline's central conflict richer than it initially appears. It is not simply a story about a right and a wrong. It is a story about two different kinds of right: Cicero's theological legitimacy and Astrid's relational authority, that cannot coexist in the same institutional space, and about what happens to the institution when those two kinds of right are never able to resolve their incompatibility. The tragedy is that both of them were, in their own terms, right, and the Brotherhood broke itself in the gap between their rightnesses. What the journals hold, the 5 volumes of Cicero's journal that you find in the Falkreath sanctuary, are among the most carefully crafted pieces of environmental storytelling in all of Skyrim. They are worth treating as primary sources, because they are the closest thing we have to Cicero's unmediated self, and because what they document across their span is a transformation that the game's writers clearly understood with considerable psychological precision. The first journal opens, as noted, in a relatively composed register. What marks it as Cicero from the very first entry is not instability but intensity. He is a person for whom things matter enormously, and the prose reflects that. There is an investment in what he is describing that goes beyond professional reporting. When he discusses a contract, it is not with the casual brevity of someone completing paperwork. It is with the attention of someone for whom each contract is, in some sense, a liturgical act, a fulfillment of the Brotherhood's sacred purpose, a small piece of evidence that the world he has committed himself to is functioning as it should. The Night Mother appears in the first journal in the role she occupies throughout, as listener, interlocutor, the person to whom Cicero directs his most unguarded thoughts. What is striking about the first journal's Night Mother entries is how structured they are. He addresses her formally. He uses language that has the quality of established liturgical phrasing. There is a ritual quality to how he opens and closes these passages, a sense of forms that have been practiced long enough to become natural. He is not improvising his relationship to her. He is inhabiting a relationship that has been shaped by the Brotherhood's traditions, fulfilling a role that has existed before him and that he has learned from predecessors. The second journal marks the middle of the vigil period. By this point, the structural changes in the prose are visible. The formal phrasing in the Night Mother passages has loosened somewhat, not abandoned, but supplemented by language that is more spontaneous, more personal, more like conversation than liturgy. He tells her things that are not strictly relevant to his keeper duties. He mentions dreams. He mentions memories of earlier contracts, people he worked with who are now gone. He mentions, in one entry, that is difficult to read without feeling its weight, that he has begun to forget what it sounds like when there are multiple voices in a room at the same time. The third journal is the most distressed of the four in terms of prose quality. This is the journal of the later Cyrodiil years, the period when the sanctuary has emptied to nearly nothing, and Cicero's connection to any social reality outside his relationship with the Night Mother is essentially severed. The laugh appears here for the first time, as noted, and the tonal consistency of earlier journals is replaced by something more volatile. Passages of genuine clarity alternating with passages where the heightened theatrical register has taken over completely and is no longer clearly a register he can move in and out of. He is not always the same person from one paragraph to the next. The jester and the assassin and the faithful keeper are all present in the third journal, but they are less integrated than they were in earlier volumes, more like competing voices than complementary aspects of a single identity. What the third journal does not lose, in any of its most fractured moments, is the faith. The theology remains intact. His belief in the Night Mother, in Sithis, in the Tenets, and the sacred structure of the Brotherhood's contract with the Void. These remain consistent even when everything else is fragmenting. If anything, they become more central as everything else recedes. The faith is not a symptom of the breakdown. The faith is what outlasts the breakdown. Everything else the years take from him, but they do not take this. The fourth journal covers the approach to Skyrim and the early Dawnstar period. It is the most erratic in terms of chronology. Time is harder to track in these entries, and the dates and events do not always cohere in the way that earlier journals managed. But it is also, in certain passages, the most vivid. Cicero's writing about the journey north, the broken wagon, the farm family, the changing landscape, the sense of approaching something important, has a quality of heightened attention that suggests his perceptual faculties, whatever else the years have done to him, remain sharp. He sees things clearly. He describes them with precision. He's not a person whose relationship to external reality has become distorted. He's a person whose relationship to his own internal experience has become distorted, which is not the same thing. The fourth journal ends without ceremony. The last entry is mid-thought, as though he put the journal down to attend to something and did not return to it. There is no conclusion, no valediction, no summary of where things stand. The sentence simply stops. And then there is the next volume, waiting on the shelf of the Falkreath sanctuary, for anyone who cares enough to pick it up and read. The weight of what he kept. There is a question that sits underneath Cicero's entire story, and that the game, characteristically, invites you to feel without ever stating outright. Was it worth it? Was the vigil worth what it cost him? Was the devotion, the isolation, the years of talking to a body in a barrel while the laugh took hold and the world outside the sanctuary shrank and shrank? Was all of that worth the outcome of a new listener eventually being named and the Brotherhood eventually being restored to some version of its former function? The game does not answer this. It cannot answer this, because the question is genuinely unanswerable in any terms that admit of a clean resolution. The utilitarian answer is no. The costs were enormous and personal, and Cicero would have remained just as devoted had he stopped after 5 years of the vigil, rather than enduring the full decade plus. The theological answer from inside Cicero's framework is yes. The Night Mother was always worth the service. The outcome was always worth the waiting. And the cost was always what faith costs when the world is not cooperating with your belief. Neither answer is wrong. They are answers from different frameworks, measuring different values. What the question opens onto, when you sit with it, is a broader reflection on what it means to maintain faith in something when the institutional support for that faith has collapsed. Cicero's situation is an extreme version of a recognizable human experience. The person who keeps believing when the community of believers has dissolved, who maintains a practice when the practice's traditional context is gone, who holds to a commitment when everyone else with the same commitment has moved on. Most people in that situation eventually stop. The effort of maintaining belief without community becomes too costly, and the self-protective wisdom of letting go asserts itself. Cicero did not let go. He could not. The question of whether this was a failure of self-protection or an example of a rarer and more costly kind of fidelity is one that different players will answer differently, and the game seems designed to accommodate both answers. What is unambiguous, looking at the full span of his story, is what it cost. The laugh, the costume as armor, the decade of conversations with silence, the journals piling up in a shrine nobody visited, the social skills that atrophied for lack of use, the professional precision that began to blur at the edges as the context that had sharpened it fell away. He gave all of that. He gave it freely, in the sense that at every stage there were exits available, and he chose not to take them. And he gave it faithfully, in the sense that the framework within which the giving made sense remained intact, even when everything else was disintegrating. The Night Mother's coffin in the Dawnstar Sanctuary is findable by any player who enters the sanctuary. It sits in the central chamber. It is large and black and conspicuous. You can walk past it without interacting with it, without reading the journals, without doing any quest associated with Cicero or the Brotherhood. It is just a coffin in a room. But if you have followed the journals, if you have read the story from the first entry to the last, the coffin is not just a coffin. It is the thing that Cicero organized his entire adult life around. It is the object at the center of the longest devotion in Skyrim's history. It is what he carried across half the continent when everything else was gone. He kept her safe. Through everything, he kept her safe. The Dawnstar Sanctuary has a recurring sound. If you stand in the central chamber and listen, the distant echo of the sea filtering through the stone. Cicero would have heard that sound every day during the time he spent here before the quest line begins. He would have heard it during his prayers, during his meals, during the long hours of whatever constituted rest for a man in his condition. The sea, unchanging and indifferent, in counterpoint to the vigil he was maintaining, and the silence from the coffin that he was waiting to end. When it ended in the most unlikely way possible. A stranger climbed into the coffin, and the Night Mother spoke to the stranger, and Cicero fell to his knees with the laugh and the tears together, the relief and the joy, and the years of accumulated waiting all releasing at once in the only way he knew how to release things. Loudly, theatrically, completely. The little jester in the motley, on his knees in a Brotherhood sanctuary, laughing and weeping because the god he had served alone in the dark for more years than most Brotherhood members served at all, had finally spoken. The people he outlasted. One of the dimensions of Cicero's story that the journals document, but that is easy to overlook in the larger arc of theological crisis and personal deterioration, is the human one. The specific people he watched leave, and what their departures meant to him. He is not, in the journals, someone who discusses relationships casually or sentimentally. The Brotherhood's training tends to produce people who hold attachment at a certain distance, who understand that emotional investment in colleagues is a vulnerability in a profession that involves frequent and sudden loss. But the journals reveal, across their span, that Cicero was not actually able to maintain that distance. He cared about the people in the Cyrodiil Brotherhood. He cared about them in the specific and complicated way that people care about the only community they have, which is to say, completely, without quite acknowledging it, in ways that only become visible once the community is gone. He mentions them by name. This is by itself something worth noting. The journals are not organizational records, and the people he names are not mentioned in the service of reporting on operational matters. He names them in the way that you mention people who are present to you, who occupy space in your mind, who have become part of the background of your daily experience. He names them, and then, entry by entry, he stops naming them. Someone dies on a contract, and the name disappears. Someone leaves without explanation, and the name disappears. The absences accumulate with the quiet relentlessness of snow. The middle journals contain entries about the small domestic facts of life in an emptying sanctuary. The silence at mealtimes, the rooms that had once held people and now held only their absence. Based on the accumulating weight of these entries, it is reasonable to picture a man eating alone at a table that used to seat others, sitting in the same place, out of habit, surrounded by chairs that nobody would fill. Whether he records this kind of specific scene explicitly, or whether the journals convey it through the texture of dozens of smaller observations, the impression is the same. Someone who is noticing, very precisely, what loneliness sounds like in a room designed for more than one person. This is one of the entries that reads as most clearly from a person rather than from a persona. The jester is not present here. The keeper is not present here. What is present is someone sitting alone in a kitchen that was designed for more than one person, eating a meal that would have tasted better with company, remembering a joke whose humor depended on the presence of someone who is gone. The simplicity of it, the ordinariness of the grief it describes, is more affecting than any of the more dramatic entries about theology or the Night Mother, or the Brotherhood's institutional collapse. He was lonely in the most fundamental way, which is to say, he'd been part of something, and then the something ended, and he was still there in the space where it had been. The sanctuary that had once been inhabited continued to exist physically, with its rooms and its hearths and its kitchen and its table with the empty chairs. And Cicero continued to exist within it, and the combination of those two continuing existences, the space and the person in the space, was its own kind of haunting. He was not a ghost, but he was living in one. The people he outlasted are worth naming, or at least worth acknowledging, as having had names, as having been real. The Brotherhood in Cyrodiil, at its reduced but still functional state during Cicero's time, there would have included people with specific skills, specific histories, specific relationships to the theology and to each other. Some of them died in service. Some of them made the pragmatic decision to leave while leaving was still possible. Some of them, one imagines, said goodbye to Cicero. Some of them may have simply stopped appearing. The journals do not always distinguish between these modes of departure. What they record is the aftermath. And what the aftermath produced, what the slow subtraction of every other person from Cicero's social world ultimately produced, was the condition for everything that followed. Not just the deterioration, but also the fidelity. The laugh and the unwavering faith are both consequences of the same isolation. He lost the people, and the loss made him stranger, and the strangeness made the faith more concentrated. And the concentration of the faith was ultimately what allowed him to keep going when a less committed person would have stopped. The people he outlasted are the invisible collaborators in his survival. Every person who left created a condition that moved him one step further from conventional sanity and one step further into the particular brand of devoted extremity that was, in the end, exactly what the Night Mother needed. She did not need a happy, well-adjusted keeper who maintained the rites as part of a larger social life. She needed exactly what Cicero became, someone for whom she was the center, the primary relationship, the axis around which everything else organized. The decade of isolation produced the keeper that the situation required. It just cost him everything else to produce it. This is not a comfortable thing to notice. It does not make the suffering meaningful in any clean, redemptive sense. Cicero did not suffer because suffering would produce the right result. He suffered because the circumstances were what they were, and he stayed because leaving was not something he was capable of, and the staying cost what it cost. The fact that the result was eventually the restoration of a divine connection that the Brotherhood had lost for years does not retroactively justify the cost. It just means the cost was not entirely in vain. Those are different things. The chairs at the kitchen table stayed empty. He ate at the same seat anyway. He kept going. And eventually, in Skyrim, the door opened and someone arrived who was supposed to arrive, and the Night Mother spoke. And the chairs that had been empty for so long were, in some strange theological sense, filled again. He laughed. Of course he laughed. The bells in the dark. There is a final image worth dwelling on, because it crystallizes something about Cicero's story that the individual details, taken separately, might not fully convey. It is the image of him in transit, on a boat crossing grey waves, sick from the motion, the Night Mother in her coffin somewhere in the hold, still and patient, while her keeper was anything but. What the crossing confirms, and what every volume of the journals confirms, is that Cicero's performance was never entirely involuntary. Even on a heaving grey sea, sick and alone, he was still writing, still thinking, still the keeper, still serving. He's not simply a person whose madness ran in one continuous uncontrolled stream. He's a person who held things together even when holding things together was almost incomprehensibly difficult. The laugh arrived when it arrived, and he could not always stop it. But the purpose, the vocation, the role that he could sustain, that he always sustained. He arrived in Skyrim. The crossing was done. The coffin had made it intact. The keeper had made it intact after a fashion. And what came next was the Dawnstar Sanctuary, and then eventually Falkreath, and then the long waiting that the journals document in their Falkreath-era entries. The agitation, the urgency, the silence that continued, the laugh that had become simply part of the air around him. He kept her safe on that crossing. He had kept her safe for years before it. And he would keep her safe for all the time in the Falkreath Sanctuary that followed, and in the Dawnstar Sanctuary that became home after the questline's end. The vigil was the shape of his life from the moment the role came to him until the moment it was completed by the arrival of the listener. He gave his sanity to it, and his youth, and the community of people who might have witnessed and shared and sustained him. He gave everything, because the alternative was not giving everything, and that was simply not something his particular and irreducible self was capable of. The grey waves and the sick Jester on them, reading about a sanctuary he had never been to. The coffin, somewhere below, still and patient. The journals, still being written, the full record of what devotion costs when the world does not cooperate with your faith. He kept going. The Brotherhood he remembered. What Cicero carried north was not just the Night Mother's body. He carried the Brotherhood's memory. In a very literal sense, he was the Brotherhood's institutional memory for a significant period of the organization's existence. The only person present across the span of its Cyrodiil decline who was paying close enough attention and committed enough to documentation to record what happened and in what order. The journals are not simply a personal account. They are, in the absence of any other surviving record, a historical document of the Dark Brotherhood's experience during one of its most difficult periods. This is why the journals in the Falkreath Sanctuary are worth finding and reading in sequence, beyond the pleasure of encountering Cicero's distinctive prose. They represent a record of what the Brotherhood was at its most reduced, as seen by someone who had known it at greater strength. They contain, between the lines of personal crisis and theological reflection, a picture of an institution maintaining its essential commitments even in conditions that made those commitments almost impossibly difficult to honor. The contracts that Cicero continued to fulfill during the vigil years, described in the early and middle journals with professional accuracy, represent the Brotherhood continuing to function as a brotherhood, taking the Black Sacrament seriously, honoring the implicit contract between the organization and the people who called upon it in their darkest moments. He never failed a contract. The journals contain no record of a contract abandoned or improperly concluded. This is, given everything else that was happening to him, remarkable. It is the professional dimension of the same character trait that made him stay as keeper. The inability to simply stop doing something he had committed to do. The refusal to allow personal circumstances to become grounds for abandoning an obligation. He was falling apart at the seams in some fundamental ways, and he still showed up for the contracts. The Brotherhood he remembered was not the one that appears in the game's questline. It was older, more populated, more formally structured. It had speakers and listeners and a functioning divine hierarchy. It had ceremonies that required multiple participants. It had kitchen tables that were occupied, and training rooms that were in use, and common areas where people gathered in the way that people in institutions gather. For meals, for conversation, for the specific pleasure of being with the people who understand the work you do. Cicero remembered that brotherhood. He had lived in it long enough for it to be the reference point against which everything subsequent was measured. The brotherhood Cicero arrived at in Skyrim, specifically the Falkreath sanctuary Astrid had built, was not that. Astrid's version was functional, warm in its own way, genuinely caring about its members, but it was organized around a human personality rather than a divine structure, and it treated its theological traditions as inheritance rather than active practice. Cicero's insistence that this was wrong was not simply the rigidity of a man who could not adapt to change. It was the grief of someone who remembered what the thing was supposed to be and could not reconcile that memory with what it had become. He mourned the brotherhood every day in the Falkreath sanctuary, in the specific and quiet way that you mourn something that still technically exists, but has changed past recognition. The coffin was there. The keeper was there. But the structure that made those things mean something, the listener, the speakers, the full functioning hierarchy of divine authority, was absent. He was maintaining the form without the substance, performing a role in a play whose other performers had all exited. Until they hadn't, until the player arrived, until the Night Mother spoke, and the structure reassembled itself around a new center, and the form found its substance again, and Cicero knelt in the sanctuary that had been his home and his prison for however long he had been there. And finally, the weight he had been carrying was shared. He did not put the costume away. He did not become, suddenly, the sober professional of the early journals. What he became was what the years had made him. The keeper, the jester, the devoted, the broken, the faithful, the laughing. But now with the theological architecture back in place around him. Now with a listener who was real and designated and present. Now with the thing he had been maintaining, against all reason justified and complete. He was still himself. The self was just no longer alone in sustaining the things it believed in. The journals on the shelves of the Falkreath sanctuary document all of this, if you take the time to read them. They sit there in the dark of the Brotherhood's home, waiting, patient as the faith they record. The first volume, clear and composed. The middle volumes, heavy and cracking. The later ones, erratic but unbroken. The full record of a man who gave everything he had to something real, and who was, against the evidence of long dark years, eventually proven right to have given it.